Thank you, Roger. I think it was last Thursday maybe that I'd gotten home and Caroline told me that our dryer was having some trouble, and she said that it had just stopped, and she went to press some buttons and it wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't come on, wouldn't do anything. And so anytime there's any sort of problem with anything, Caroline's thought is just give it a rest. Just unplug it, let it rest. Whatever it is, it's tired. If you give it a rest, it'll work. And most of the time that aggravates me, but it's strange how often, unusually, that her strategy actually works. Anyway, so she said, the good news is I gave it a rest and I started later and it came back on. So I think we're back in business. And for a family with 6 kids, we need a dryer. We need that to be in business. Anyway, it was, I think later that night, we'd had some clothes that were in the dryer, and Caroline said something about wondering, it doesn't seem like enough air is, like when you went outside, it didn't seem like there was much airflow. And she called me to come look at it, and I noticed that there was essentially no airflow coming out. It was just kind of radiant heat pouring out. So essentially what we've got is an oven with clothes in it. And so I said, we need to stop this. This is a fire hazard now, and because it's tumbling and it's heating up, but it's just not, there's no airflow. And I'm reasonably handy, and so I took the back off and I looked at some YouTube videos, and I was trying to see if I could troubleshoot this thing to figure out what the problem was. And I'd gotten the back off, and I narrowed it down to essentially 3 parts. And at this point, I started to do some math, and I thought, all right, so it could be 1 of these parts, it could be 3 of these parts. Now, there's an appliance store in Greensboro where I might be able to get them. It's possible I may have to order them and wait for them. Once I get them, I have to take the back off, I have to take the top off, I have to take the belt off, I have to take the drum out, and then finally, in the very bottom of this thing, I can get to the parts that I believe are broken. If I'm replacing something that's not broken, the appliance store, the appliance parts store is not going to refund that part. So it's you bought it, it's yours. And so I'm thinking, I don't know. That sounds like a losing proposition in terms of money. The other thing is I thought, well, I could call somebody. And if I called an appliance repair place, they'd come out, they would diagnose the problem correctly, but they almost never have parts, so they would be ordering the parts, and we can't afford to be down with a washer or a dryer. I need this fixed pronto. Besides that, I came to the conclusion I'm probably in for at least $250. Now, this dryer is 11 years old. One of the reasons that I don't believe in reincarnation is that I'm afraid I might come back as either our washer or dryer, because in 11 years, I bet a solid 9 of them, that thing has been running constantly because we wash so many clothes. And so I'm thinking, $250, I'm just not going to. What we need to do at this point, what I've resigned myself to, is we're just going to replace it. We're going to start now with new. And to me, that made sense. And in fact, in a lot of cases, in a lot of circumstances in life, when there's some sort of problem, when it gets to a certain point, you decide, I just need to replace this. I need to start from scratch. Sometimes it is your computer is like that, and it gets so slow and there's so many problems, you decide, I'm just going to buy a new computer. I'm going to start fresh from scratch. Maybe your shoes are a problem. You decide, it's time, I'm just going to go get a new pair of shoes. If your lawnmower is long in the tooth and it's giving some problems to you, you say, I'm just going to replace this. I'm going to start with new. And we can do that with a whole slew of things in life, but one of the things that we can't do that with is personal relationships. When our personal relationships begin to sour, when they start turning south, we can't, in truth, we might say that we're going to try to start from scratch, but in truth, we can't really start new, can we? I mean, things that have been said can't be unsaid. Things that have been done, you can't roll back the clock and not do them. Memories that have been made, for good or bad, they can't be erased and replaced with different ones. And that's not just true, generally speaking, with human relationships. It's also true specifically with family relationships. Now, I am certain that every one of you here today knows another family that you think is crazier than your family. And aren't you grateful that they're around, right? So, regardless of that, every family, including my own, possesses a certain level of dysfunction. Now, granted, some families are crazier than others, but we're all crazy. Every one of our families is messed up because every one of our families has in it people, all of us, who are to varying degrees just plain messed up. And because of that, sometimes what is going to happen is that even within families, we are going to be wronged. Someone is going to hurt us. There's something that they are going to do. There's going to be a failure of response. There's going to be something that they said, some manner in which they replied to us that is absolutely going to cut us. And our family, those relationships can very well get to the point where they are estranged and broken. So what do? Do you just say, all right, I'm just going to get a new family? Well, you can't do that. You say, I'm just going to get new relationships. No, because you can't really make them new. So here's the question. If the relationships get broken, they need to be reconciled. So the question is, what can I do to help bring about reconciliation? Today we're going to think about that question as we land the series that I've been doing called Family Function. And we've been dropping in at various places in the book of Genesis, looking at some family circumstances where things go haywire. And today we're going to see an example, not where things go haywire, but actually where we see a wonderful example of a pattern that we can and should follow if we want to experience reconciliation in any of our relationships, but specifically in our family relationships. What can we do? Look with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 45. Genesis 45, we read, starting in verse 1, Joseph could no longer keep his composure in front of all his attendants. So he called out, "Send everyone away from me." Now, no one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers, but he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and also Pharaoh's household heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near me." And they came near. "I am Joseph, your brother," he said, "the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. The famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He's made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler over all the land of Egypt." Here again is our question we're going to think about today. What is it that I can do? What is it that you can do in relationships in general, but specifically in your family? What is it that you can do to bring about reconciliation? The first thing you can do is this. Do not add insult to injury. Do not add insult to injury. Since we last left Joseph, a lot has happened. We talked about how there was this man named Jacob who had 12 sons, and number 11 was Joseph. And he demonstrated, without question, just off the charts favoritism. You remember we talked about the coat of many colors, and the favoritism was such that it caused his brothers to absolutely hate him. They could not, Genesis tells us, they could not even speak peaceably to him. And so at first they decided, we're just going to kill him. We're just going to kill him. That'll be one way to get rid of our problem, just kill him. But then they decided, no, we're not going to do that. Instead, what we will do is we'll get something for our misery of dealing with him. We'll sell him to slave traders. So they're going to sell their own flesh and blood, their own brother, to slave traders. And that's exactly what they do. And what happens, and I would encourage you, if you've never read these stories or it's been some time, I would encourage you, the whole second half of Genesis contains the stories of Joseph and all the twists and turns. And these are wonderful stories and wonderful descriptions of the ways in which God is able to work and all the harrowing things that Joseph goes through. But in short, Joseph winds up as a slave in Egypt. And there's a whole lot of stuff that he goes through, among them being falsely accused of sexual assault, winding up in prison. But now at this point, he's essentially the prime minister of Egypt. He's number 2. The only person that he doesn't answer to is the Pharaoh himself. And what God has done is to give Joseph the ability, among other things, to interpret dreams. And there was this dream the Pharaoh had that he was puzzled by, and Joseph reveals this dream means that a 7-year famine is coming. And we need to prepare for it. And because he did this, it led the nation of Egypt, compared to all their neighbors, they were prepared. They were able to not simply get by, but survive and thrive when people around them, including Joseph's family back at home, while they are actively starving to death. And so, being aware that Egypt has food, Joseph's brothers head to Egypt. And they happen to come to the place where Joseph is. Now, they don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes them. Perhaps because of all the regalia and the trappings of opulence and power, they don't recognize him. And for all they're concerned, Joseph is probably dead. He sees them, he recognizes them, and what we've just read is when the curtain is pulled back and he reveals himself to his brothers. And so, with that being said, let's just step back for a second and to think in plain brass tacks. Joseph has been horribly, horribly wronged by his brothers. Maybe your siblings or maybe someone in your family has done something against you. Maybe they have said something hurtful to you. Maybe they have taken something that you thought belonged to you. I don't know what you have been the victim of, and you might say it was terrible what you have been through, but let me just tell you this. Whatever it is you have been on the receiving end of, it's not as bad as being sold as a slave to a foreign country. Whatever you've been through, Joseph experienced it worse. And in spite of that, Joseph is operating intent on and marching towards reconciliation. And Joseph has been through this terrible, terrible series of experiences. And as he has experienced these things, bear in mind, this did not happen by chance. Joseph did not wind up in Egypt because he made a wrong turn. He wound up in Egypt because his own brothers decided, instead of killing him, we will sell him as a slave. That didn't happen accidentally. They did this. They did this with purpose, with malice, with intention, with forethought. This was first-degree stuff that they did to their brother. And with all that as backdrop, think about the tongue lashing that Joseph could have given to his brothers at this point. It is absolutely off the charts. Beyond that, he could have had them imprisoned. He could have had them beaten. He could have had them summarily executed. All he had to do was to speak the word, and their lives were over. Joseph had that much power. But does he do any of that? No. Does he even verbally accost them? No, he doesn't do that. What does he do? He says this. In verse 4, I am Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. That's it. That's it. Does he begin to harangue them, which candidly they were deserving of? Does he begin to harangue them and to say, you would not believe all the stuff that I've been through because of you? You idiots. You hateful, despicable, loathsome, awful wretches. All the stuff that I've been through. When I was sitting in a prison, all I could think is my brothers put me here. When I was being falsely accused, I was thinking I shouldn't have been here, but I was here because of my lousy brothers. Does he do any of that? He doesn't. What he does is that he calls their action for what it was. But that's where he leaves it. That's where he leaves it. Hey, it's Joseph. I'm the one that you did this to. That's it. He calls the behavior for what it is, no more, no less, and he doesn't go for the jugular. He doesn't, with his words, make matters worse. And while it may very well have felt good to do that, Joseph doesn't do it. Why? Because he's working towards reconciliation. At the outset, I talked to you about a dryer problem that we had. Let me give you a few more details about that. Our oldest three boys run cross country, and we've had some rain lately, and at one of their cross country events, they're running essentially through mud, and their shoes were absolutely filthy. And so the other day, I put them in the washing machine and washed them. And then I left to go to church. And when Caroline tells me later the dryer isn't working, she says, I put the shoes in the dryer. Well, let me back the clock up about 10 years. Right after we moved here, I had never washed tennis shoes before. But I knew that you could put them in the washing machine. And anything you put in the washing machine, my thought is you can put it in the dryer. Long story short, I put shoes in the dryer and I broke our dryer. They got wedged in there. Thankfully, it was under warranty, and it didn't cost us anything. All right, so now, 10 years later, for the second time, shoes, in fact, write that in your Bible. Do not put shoes in the dryer. Rule number 2, obey all rules. Anyway, so for the second time in our household, shoes have gone in the dryer, and for the second time now, our dryer is kaput. I'm not going to lie. I wanted to fuss. I really did. There's all sorts of stuff I wanted to say. Like, we have been down this road before. All kinds of stuff I want to say. But not because I am anything, and not because I have some great skill or some profound discipline, but I didn't fuss. I didn't say some of the stuff that you can imagine that you maybe would want to say that might feel good in the moment to say. But I didn't say any of that. Why didn't I say any of that? Or for one thing, because I had done it before. Secondly, when I did it, she didn't fuss at me. And thirdly, if I have done this before and she didn't fuss at me, there's no use me fussing at her because, among other things, it wouldn't help. We've still got a broken dryer. There is no good that can come from this. I get the fact, and human nature leads us to say sometimes it just feels good to unload, and I get that. But you have to ask yourself this question. When relationships are strained, when some wrong has occurred, what do I want the end result to be? Do I want things to be whole and mended and reconciled, or am I content with separation? If what you want is reconciliation, you and I need to follow the example. And I realize this is much easier said than done, but we've got to follow the example of a guy that walked with God, a man named Joseph, and do not add insult to injury. I'm not suggesting that you and I that we ignore wrongs that have been done. What I'm saying is that we don't maximize them, that we don't inflate them, that we don't make a bigger deal out of it than they otherwise are. That's exactly what Joseph does. He says this to his brothers, "This is what you did to me." He doesn't unpack it. The actions are significant enough to speak for themselves. He did not add insult to injury. But there's another thing we need to do, and that's this. Keep your focus on what God has done. Keep your focus on what God has done. This is so wonderfully and beautifully demonstrated by Joseph in this passage. He knows, without question, what his brothers did. He's not fuzzy in his mind about, well, did they? No, he knows exactly what they did. He remembers what it was like to sit in that pit and to hear them talk about murdering him, only to intentionally, deliberately, with malice and forethought, sell him to slave traders. He knows what is done. But how, at this point, is he viewing their actions? He is viewing their actions through the lens of what can best be described as providence. As providence. You know, every once in a while, that's a word that we hear or is floated around. But what exactly is providence? In short, providence is the direct activity of God. So when we're talking about providence, we're talking about what God is actively doing. Let me give an example. It could be that you would have said, or you could have heard someone say, "Man, that was so close. I was driving and this car ran a red light, almost T-boned me, but I was so lucky. I just barely got by them. I was so lucky." Hearing that, you may say, you know what, that wasn't luck, that was providence. That was God actively working to spare you what otherwise could have been real harm. That was providence. That was God at work. What is Joseph doing, and how is he describing these actions and looking at what his brothers have done? He is viewing all of this through the lens of the providence of God. Now, that does not mean that Joseph is implying that it was God who threw him in a pit, that it was God who thought about murdering, that it was God who sold him as a slave. He understands the absolute culpability, the intentional culpability of his brothers, but what he does is that he's not focusing on that. Rather, it is that he is looking at how God providentially, that God's providence accomplished some meaningful, wonderful, and positive things. In fact, he describes it this way, that that it gets to the point, he even views it now that God sent him ahead to Egypt, according to verse 7, to establish you as a remnant within the land, that God is wanting to use you as part of his people and to make sure that there's a remnant even in the face of a famine. He says that God has used me to be here to save lives. He says at the end of verse 5 that God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. So again, he's not excusing or diminishing what they've done. He called it for what it was. Hey, guys, you're the one that sold me into slavery, but this is what happened. God was able to use that and use me to save people's lives, including your own, such that you might even be a remnant of his people on the face of the earth. In fact, by the time you get to chapter 50, in his own words, he summarizes it this way. He says to his brothers near the end of his life, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. So what has happened is that the bad stuff that you have done, God used them for amazing and wonderful, positive, meaningfully good things. But is that a left-hand side of your Bible, Old Testament concept? No, that's just how God works. In fact, you're probably familiar with how Paul describes it in Romans chapter 8. He says to those of us that know the Lord, he says that we know that God works all things together for good to those who love him or are called according to his purpose. Now, Paul does not say that God only uses good things. Rather, he says God uses all things, even the bad stuff that other people may do, even the hurtful things that family members may say to us, maybe even the things that could otherwise cause estrangement, even within our own homes. God can use and is actively working. His providence is working to accomplish actual good things, even out of bad. And what's Joseph's focus? Is he thinking about and putting himself back in the pit that day when his brothers drew him out and said, oh, by the way, sold to the highest bidder? No, what's his focus? His focus is on what God has done. Why? Because he's working towards reconciliation. And if there is estrangement in personal relationships, you as a follower of Christ, we've got to operate differently than those that don't know the Lord. And if the destination is reconciliation, you can't maximize the wrong that's been done. Call it for what it is, but don't add insult to injury. But then you got to keep your focus on what God has done. I realize this is easier said than done, but there's a form of this type of behavior that occurs on a regular basis. There's a stack of you ladies here today who have children. There's others who are watching online that have children. My wife obviously has a stack of children. And what's interesting is this. At least 3 times I've had episodes in my life, thankfully it's been a long time, with kidney stones. And the first time I had them, it was just terrible. I felt like an elephant was sitting on my back. I mean, it was just excruciating. I mean, just terrible, terrible, terrible. And when I have experienced those, in fact, the first time I was working at the bank and some of the ladies said this, well, that's the closest that you'll get to what? To childbirth. To childbirth. So childbirth, how was that experience? Well, it's terrible. It's horrible. In fact, Genesis 3 tells us, oh, by the way, it's going to be terrible. Thank you, sin, right? It is terrible, awful, awful. But ladies, those of you who have had children and have been through the experience of childbirth, when someone says, oh, you have such a beautiful daughter, you have such a handsome son, yeah, but Lord help me, that day that they came in, oh, it was the worst day ever. Oh, they're so beautiful. But I'll tell you, that big old head, I'm telling you, that head. You talking about bowling ball Ben there? You don't do that. In fact, yesterday, Carol and I were sitting in the den. John, our 1-year-old, was in there, and he's a happy, delightful little guy. And we were talking about, not even about childbirth at this point, but a number of our kids have been bad spitter-uppers, but John was just terrible. I mean, he was like a spitting-up machine. And we're talking about that. Man, aren't you glad that we're beyond that? And Caroline said, I'd almost forgotten about that. Isn't it amazing, all of these horrible things, that what happens? You intentionally put them out of your mind. You don't focus on those things. Instead, you focus on what is actually good. If, and I'm telling you, we are all going to experience this. Why? Because all of our families are crazy. Why? Because all of our families are made of crazy people, just like me and just like you. And there's going to be trouble in paradise. There just is. And there's going to be hurtful feelings, and there's going to be things that are said, and there's going to be division. And unfortunately, that's a reality, but reconciliation can occur. But for you, as a follower of Jesus, you're going to have to work towards it. And one of the ways you can do that is to keep your focus on what God has done. Because God has been actively even using hurtful things to accomplish good purposes. Focus on that. It's the last thing that we need to do, and that's this. Build the bridges you want to see crossed. Build the bridges you want to see crossed. After having revealed himself to his brothers, he addresses what they did, but he focuses on what God has done. And starting in verse 9, he gives them some instruction. He says, I want you to return quickly to my father and tell them this is what your son... And I want you to go back and tell Dad what's going on. And that God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You can settle in the land of Goshen. Be near me, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. He says in verse 11, there I will sustain you. And this is not a promise simply to his father, but to all of his brothers. For there will be 5 more years of famine. Otherwise, everyone's going to become destitute. And verse 14 says that Joseph threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. Joseph kissed each of his brothers as he wept, and afterwards his brothers talked to him. Remember the last time we heard about Joseph and his brothers talking, it says they couldn't even speak peaceably to him. But now they can. Why? Because reconciliation has occurred. How did reconciliation occur? Because Joseph built the bridge. Joseph owned the process and actively sought to reach out and not just to wave the olive branch, but to actively take meaningful steps to try to resume relationship again. But who is this? Not just Joseph. It's also what? It's the victim. Wait a minute. Joseph is the victim. Absolutely he is. He's the one they threw in the pit. He's the one they thought about killing. He's the one they sold into slave. The reason that there's been separation is because of the brothers. It was their fault. They were working. They were malicious. They were deceitful. They were all of these things. But who's reaching out? Joseph is. The victim is. And you have these two parties that are completely separated and estranged, Joseph and his brothers. And if there is separation between here and there, what do you need? You need a bridge. And what does Joseph do? He builds the bridge that he wants crossed. Why? Because he's working towards reconciliation. Hearing that, you may say, I don't like that at all. I mean, Joseph is the victim. They should be bowing down and kissing his ring, kissing his feet. They have been so terrible to him, but he is reaching out to them. He is embracing them. He is offering to provide for them. How in the world is it? I don't know how in the world something like this could happen, that those who are estranged are able to come back together because the victim builds the bridge. What kind of crazy talk is that? What kind of crazy behavior is that? Can I answer it with one simple answer? It's the same way that Jesus acted, isn't it? Listen to what John tells us. Bear in mind that we have done God horribly wrong. That he established rules that we knew the right and we intentionally just did things our own way. We have violated that, yet he looked at us through love and laid down his life. In fact, we talked about it earlier out of 1 Peter, that Christ suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, the innocent for the guilty. Why? To bring us to God. What is that? That's reconciliation. And what does John tell us in 1 John chapter 2, Verse 5, he says, this is how we know we are in him. So here's a litmus test for what it looks like to be in relationship and in connection with the Lord. This is how we know we're in him. The one who says he remains in him should do what? Should walk just as he walked. What I'm telling you is that Joseph is doing the same type of thing that later, to a much greater degree, that Jesus is going to do. And like it or not, the reality is for those of us who are followers of Jesus, the expectation is that we do things like him. If we take our walk with him seriously, and if the goal is restoration. Listen, let me just tell you that doing things like Jesus is not something that you can just will yourself to do and say, all right, I'm gonna improve, I'm gonna do better, I'm gonna create a to-do list, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna tell you, you've got to lean on him. And you've got to say, listen, I can't do this without your help. This is fighting against my nature to the core of my being. But how you reconciled me to God, I want to be reconciled with people in my life, people in my home. And Lord, I need your help to follow your example. The good news, help is available. Will you bow your heads with me? At various points in the service, we've talked about having a personal relationship with God. We've talked about how it is that God in Christ has taken the initiative to make it possible for us to know and walk with him. And whether you are here in person or you're online, let me just ask you very simply, do you know you have that? If not, will you respond to that unease? To that question that you're having, that you're struggling with inside? And listen, we want to help you as a church. If you're here after the service, I would love to spend as much time as you would want to help settle that. If you're watching online, reach out to us. Call us, 292-8672. Reach us, info@gatecitybaptist.org. We will reach out to you because Jesus has reached out to you. But if you've already crossed that line and you're in God's family and you know that, that's wonderful. That doesn't mean that your family, even if it's comprised of other followers of Jesus, is perfect. Because we're still a bunch of screw-ups. Estrangement happens. Hurt occurs. But the good news is that reconciliation is always possible, and you can be, and God expects you to be part of the process. He's given us a great example. He's revealed to us truths that he wants us to take seriously, but it supersedes our own individual ability to do this. So we need to ask for help. Do you need to ask the Lord for that help today? As Karen is playing, I just want to give you a few moments just to talk to the Lord and say, God, this is what's going on. I want to pray for my family. I want to pray that reconciliation becomes a reality. I want you to help me to follow your example, to take the initiative, to own this. Maybe you just want to come and kneel at this altar. You can do that. But however God's speaking to you, he's inviting you to respond, and my hope is that you will. As she plays, you just talk to the Lord. Words of that song say, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. And that's not just our individual lives, it's even the lives of our families. And let me just remind you that God wants to demonstrate the difference not only that he can make in the life of a person, but also in the life of a family. And going forward, if we can help you, if we can pray with you about something, if there is some counsel that you need, please reach out to us, because we want to help you, because God wants to demonstrate what he and he alone can do. God bless you. Thank you for being here this morning. If you are watching online as a guest, thank you for doing so. If you'd like some more information about who it is that we are and what it is that we're about, please reach out to us. We'd be glad to share with you that information. If you're here today as a guest, we hope if you haven't already, stop by our Welcome Center and we will give you a Corona-free gift just for being here today. And we're grateful that you are here. Listen, I hope it's a wonderful week where you demonstrate again the difference that Christ can make in the life of a person and a family. God bless you. We're going to start today with 1 and 3. 1 and 3. If you would be dismissed, give them a break, and then 2 and 4, you can sneak out.